The arrogant Arab billionaire declared, "Whoever solves this problem, the company is theirs." 200 engineers were at a loss until the poor waitress pulled up a chair, and exactly 60 seconds later, she did something that silenced the entire room. What did the waitress possess that 200 engineers lacked? Follow the story to find out what happened at that party. Nearly $1 billion in investment, and this is the best you can do. Adrian Malik's voice wasn't loud, but it sliced through the melodious piano music at Al-Qasr restaurant like broken glass. It was cold, controlled, and that very control was the most terrifying thing. He sat ramrod straight in his tailored suit, but the tension in his shoulders suggested a storm was about to break. David, his assistant, bowed his head, avoiding his boss's gaze. "Sir, we have tried every option. This problem was outside our projections." Adrian let out a scoff, dry and devoid of humor. He hadn't touched the Wagyu steak in front of him, which had long gone cold. All his attention was focused on the tablet placed in the center of the table. On the screen, a complex 3D model was spinning wildly amidst countless lines of red error warnings. It was the heart of Project Veyron, a quantum encryption system touted as unbreakable. Clearly, it had managed to break itself. "They just rejected the contract," Adrian said, his voice hissing through clenched teeth. $5 billion gone, because of something you call the best effort. This was more than just a failure. This was a humiliation. Adrian Malik did not fail, and certainly not like this, at a business dinner that was supposed to be a celebration. He picked up his wine glass, then set it down forcefully. A dry clack echoed, and a few drops of dark red wine splattered, spreading across the pristine white tablecloth like a confession. His helplessness fueled his arrogance. He pushed the tablet toward David, his voice slightly louder, enough for nearby tables to glance over. "Solve this problem," he announced, his voice thick with sarcasm, "and my company belongs to that person." David and the chief engineer offered forced smiles. A bitter joke. Those nearby who heard merely shrugged, just another rich guy dramatizing his life. They quickly returned to their own conversations. A figure approached. The young waitress approached with a tray of water. She moved lightly, skillfully avoiding the chairs, almost blending into the background piano music in the corner of the room. Her name was Nora. She had only worked here for 6 weeks, taking the evening shift to pay her rent. She was accustomed to the elegantly dressed patrons, the snide remarks, the glances that passed right through her as if she were air. As Nora leaned down to pour water for Adrian, she didn't intend to look at the screen in front of him, but the reflective blue light caused her to glance over and stop. The symbols, models, and repetitive code sequences. Too familiar. Her heart gave a slight thump. She had seen that kind of structure before, during her long months of research in her old college days. She said nothing, continued pouring the water, set the pitcher down, prepared to turn away. But Adrian's words still echoed in her mind, clear and sharp. "Whoever solves this problem, the company is theirs." A statement that anyone else here would consider a joke. To Nora, however, it was an open challenge. She stood still. For a few seconds, thoughts raced chaotically in her mind. She knew she shouldn't interfere. It was taboo for a server to intervene in a guest's business. But a part of her, the part that loved technology, that had dedicated her youth to research, could not remain silent. Adrian noticed she hadn't left yet. He frowned, his voice hoarse with fatigue. "Is there a problem?" Nora stood straight, her hands still holding the water tray, her eyes calm. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. I know where the error is." The entire table fell silent. David looked up, surprised. The other associate leaned forward slightly, thinking he had misheard. Adrian looked at her for a few seconds, unsure whether to burst out laughing. "What did you say?" "That model." Nora nodded slightly toward the tablet. You are assuming the quantum particles are static, while the simulation data indicates movement. The result is flawed from the foundation. The statement was simple yet full of confidence. A few nearby tables turned around, as her voice was loud enough to cut through the piano music. Adrian Malik, the billionaire known for his cold demeanor, sat up straight, his gaze fixed on the girl in the restaurant uniform. Did you just say, flawed foundation assumption? Yes. You cannot simulate kinetic energy using a static system, Nora replied. Her voice was low, steady, and devoid of fear. I wrote my thesis on this subject. No one spoke further. David turned to Adrian, his gaze awkward. She seems to know what she's talking about. Adrian watched her for a long moment. Something shifted in his mind, subtle but real. She bowed her head. I apologize if I overstepped. I just couldn't pretend not to see such an obvious error. Then she walked away, leaving the three stunned men in silence. Nora returned to the service counter, setting down her tray. She could hear her heart pounding fast, her hands trembling slightly, but she felt no regret. She didn't know if what she had done was foolish or brave. She only knew that, after a very long time, she felt truly alive again. In the corner of the room, Adrian was still watching her receding figure. He said nothing, but in his mind, the sentence repeated word for word. You cannot simulate kinetic energy using a static system. A small sentence, but it was enough to make him want to know. Who was she? A man of immense power had just been challenged by a waitress, and he didn't know that this would be the beginning of everything changing. Nora set the water pitcher down on the table, a small but decisive action. The soft clinking of glass against wood was the only answer to Adrian's question. She didn't state her name. Instead, she repeated her assertion, her voice still steady, without the slightest tremor. I said, I think I know where the error is. David quickly interjected, his voice full of annoyance. Excuse me, could you please return to your duties? We are having an important meeting. He viewed her presence as a distraction, a violation of space. But Adrian raised a hand, a brief, commanding gesture that silenced David. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. His eyes narrowed as he assessed Nora from head to toe. A smirk, full of condescension, spread across his lips. No, let her speak. This is fascinating. A waitress is going to lecture me on quantum technology. The mockery in his tone was palpable. But Nora did not flinch. She had faced worse looks than this. She looked straight at the chaotic model on the screen, not at Adrian. This is parallel form quantum encryption, she began, her voice sounding more like a professor lecturing than a waitress. Your model assumes that the quantum particles are static data points, and you are trying to correct the error of each point individually. But the problem is not with the particles. It is with the relationship between them. She looked up, meeting the chief engineer's eyes. The core issue is their interaction within a flow of motion. You're trying to freeze a river instead of navigating its current. She didn't use overly complicated jargon. She pointed out the flaw in the very philosophy, in the fundamental logic of the problem. Silence descended. The smile faded from Adrian's lips. He turned to the chief engineer, who was stunned. Is she right? The engineer stared at the screen, then back at Nora, stammering. Theoretically, she has a point. We were too focused on the details and missed the big picture. The atmosphere around the table froze. The contempt in Adrian's eyes vanished, replaced by an intense, almost dangerous curiosity. He pushed the tablet toward her. Fine. Prove it. He repeated his earlier challenge, but this time without sarcasm. His voice was cold and serious. If you can do it, This company is yours." Nora looked him straight in the eye. "Are you serious?" "I never joke about money," Adrian replied curtly. Without a moment's hesitation, Nora set her serving tray on a nearby empty table. She untied her white apron, folded it neatly, and placed it on top of the tray. Then she pulled up an empty chair and sat down at their table. The surrounding diners began to notice the strange sight: a waitress who had just joined the dinner of one of the city's most powerful men. Nora's fingers glided across the tablet's touchscreen. They moved quickly, decisively, and with immense confidence. She didn't fix every line of error code. She accessed the core structure of the algorithm directly. She didn't correct, she restructured. She changed a few fundamental parameters regarding particle interaction that Adrian's 200 engineers had overlooked. The entire restaurant seemed absolutely silent. Only the soft clicks of her fingers on the screen could be heard. 10 minutes. That was all the time she needed. She pressed the rerun simulation button. The chaotic 3D model on the screen stopped spinning. It began to move, the molecular chains linking together smoothly and stably. All the red error warnings disappeared. In their place, a single line of green text appeared in the center of the screen. Verification successful. The entire table was speechless. David and the chief engineer gasped, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. Adrian stood motionless, his eyes darkened. He looked at the screen, then at Nora. His emotions were a complex mess: shock, embarrassment, and unconcealed admiration. For the first time in his life, he was completely defeated. Not by a formidable business rival, not by a market fluctuation, but by a waitress who had just solved $1 billion problem in 10 minutes right in front of him. Nora gently pushed the tablet sliding across the table, returning it to Adrian. A simple, decisive action. "It's done," she said, not with smugness, but like a craftsman who had just completed her work. That action broke the stunned silence. The restaurant manager, a dapper middle-aged man named Franco, rushed over. He had been watching the strange spectacle from afar with increasing anxiety. "Mr. Malik, I sincerely apologize for this inconvenience," he said, his voice full of remorse, glancing sternly at Nora. "I will handle this immediately." "Handle what?" Adrian asked, his voice still steady but his eyes fixed on Nora. He didn't even look at Franco. "Why, my staff has been bothering you," Franco stammered. Adrian finally turned to him. He said nothing, simply looked. A cold, emotionless stare, but it carried the weight of a command. Franco immediately understood. He bowed his head, mumbled another apology, and quickly backed away, leaving a space of silence around the table. Then, Adrian turned to David and the chief engineer, both still staring at the screen in disbelief. "You two may leave." It was a polite dismissal. They nodded mechanically, stood up, and gathered their belongings in embarrassment and confusion. Before leaving, the chief engineer turned back to Nora, genuine respect evident in his eyes. "Thank you." Nora merely gave a slight nod. Now only the two of them remained, sitting opposite each other amidst the cooled dishes and the distant piano music. The tension had vanished, replaced by a heavy curiosity. Adrian spoke first. The condescension was gone from his voice, replaced only by intense focus. "Where did you learn all that?" "MIT," Nora replied succinctly, her eyes fixed on the apron she had placed on the chair. The word escaped her lips like a sigh, recalling a world she had lost. Adrian froze for a second. "MIT," he repeated, as if trying to connect two entirely unrelated pieces of information. "An MIT student, and now you're wiping tables and pouring water in this restaurant." Nora offered a faint, sad smile. "That's a long story." She looked up, meeting his eyes. Her gaze no longer held self-defense, but a blend of weariness and bruised pride. When people take everything away from you, Your Honor, your career, even your name, you have to find a way to survive, no matter how. That sentence touched a hidden corner in Adrian's personality. He understood how this world worked. He had witnessed rivals destroyed, careers ruined. But hearing it from this girl, who had just demonstrated extraordinary talent, carried an entirely different meaning. His initial contempt had completely disappeared, replaced by curiosity and something bordering on admiration. The promise of the company, spoken in arrogance, now seemed ridiculous. He made another offer, more serious and practical. "Tomorrow, 10 a.m., come to my office at Falcon Tower. I want to hear your entire story." He pulled out his wallet, taking out a black credit card. "And I will pay you $100,000 for what you did tonight." Nora stood up. She did not look at the card. She picked up her apron, expertly tying it back on. The action was like donning a piece of armor. "I will come," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But I don't need your money. I just need you to listen." She bowed politely, then turned and walked toward the kitchen area, blending back into the serving staff. She left Adrian alone at the table, with the repaired tablet, the credit card on the table, and a story he knew he absolutely had to hear. Exactly 10 a.m. The next morning, Nora stepped through the revolving glass doors of Falcon Tower. She wasn't wearing the waitress uniform. Instead, she wore simple, clean dark jeans and a white shirt. Her hair was still neatly tied back. She didn't look like a server, nor did she look like a technology genius. She was simply someone who came here to tell a story. The reception was pre-informed. Without hesitation, she was taken straight to the top floor in a private, fast, and silent elevator. The elevator doors opened, leading directly into Adrian's office. It was a vast space, 3 walls of glass, overlooking the entire panorama of Dubai below. The skyscrapers looked like toys. The interior was minimalist and expensive. The contrast between his world and the world she was living in had never been so stark. Adrian was standing with his back to her, looking out the window, his hands clasped behind his back. He wasn't sitting behind his desk, a deliberate action to minimize the power differential. When he heard the elevator doors open, he turned around. "Hello," he said, his voice lacking the tension of the previous night. He gestured toward the sofa set in the corner. "Please sit." Nora sat down, her back straight. She didn't appear overwhelmed by the luxury. She simply waited. Adrian sat down on the chair opposite her. Between them was a glass coffee table. He immediately got to the point. "Last night you said people took everything from you. Who?" Nora took a deep breath. She began to tell her story, her voice steady, without a tremor, as if recounting facts in a report. "I used to have a startup named Lumina Tech. I co-founded it with my ex-boyfriend, Julian Vance. We were the stars of the computer science department at MIT, specializing in quantum encryption." She spoke of sleepless nights in the lab, the excitement when they made their first breakthroughs, the initial contracts with venture capital funds. "We built everything together from scratch. I trusted him absolutely. Until one day I happened to discover every patent, every piece of intellectual property we created together was only under his name. The company formation contract I signed had been swapped." Adrian frowned, a visceral reaction from a businessman. He understood the value of intellectual property. "Why didn't you sue?" A faint, almost imperceptible smile crossed Nora's lips. "I tried." But he had prepared everything in advance. He used the investors' money to hire the best legal team in New York. And me? I only had meager savings. He painted me as a greedy opportunist, trying to steal his work. She paused, looking out the window, toward the vast city. "No one believed me. The investors sided with him. MIT froze my academic records due to ongoing legal disputes. I was blacklisted in the industry. I lost everything. From a promising founder, I became penniless, drowning in legal fees. So, I started serving, she concluded, her voice still calm, to pay off debt and to survive. She turned back to look straight into Adrian's eyes. Have you ever seen this world when there is no longer room for the truth, Mr. Malik? Adrian was silent for a long time. He had faced ruthless rivals, dirty corporate schemes, but Nora's story touched on something deeper, the absolute betrayal from the person she loved and trusted most. He could see the resilience hidden beneath her calm exterior, a strength forged by pain. For the first time, he did not see her as a valuable asset he had just found, but as a person who had suffered an injustice that money could never compensate for. He spoke, his voice lower, more intimate. Call me Adrian. When Nora left the office, the door closed softly behind her. Adrian remained standing by the window, looking at the second access card lying on the table, the copy he had quietly kept for himself. For the first time, he wasn't sure if he was testing her or afraid of trusting her too much. After Nora left, Adrian did not return to work. He remained on the sofa, staring into the space where she had sat. Her story repeated in his mind, not with pity, but with a cold calculation. He could hire her, pay her a substantial salary, turn her into an effective tool to complete Project Veyron. That was the usual way, the way Adrian Malik had always operated. But something about her determined eyes, the way she spoke of betrayal without shedding a single tear, made him reconsider. He realized that what he needed was not an employee, but something else, something money couldn't buy. That evening, he called her. David had found her phone number in the restaurant's personnel files. Nora, he said when she answered, his voice completely different from that of a commanding CEO. I want to invite you to dinner, not Al-Qasr restaurant, just somewhere we can talk. He chose a small, cozy eatery tucked away in the Souk al-Bahar cafe area, a place with exposed brick walls and simple wooden tables, no white tablecloths, no glove-wearing servers. A world completely different from what he was used to, yet closer to the world Nora was living in. When she arrived, she was still wearing the simple clothes from the morning. They sat at a table near the window. The server placed 2 glasses of water on the table and left them alone. No expensive wine, no complicated menus, just the raw truth. Adrian spoke first, his voice sincere. I've been thinking about your story all day. I want to understand. Not because you solved my problem, but because you made me uneasy. He looked straight into her eyes. You have the talent to change an entire industry, yet you accepted a job where no one could see that talent. Nora smiled faintly, the first genuine smile he had seen. That's not acceptance. That's patience. I am waiting for an opportunity, not charity. She took a sip of water. You are used to controlling everything with money and power. When you meet someone you can't buy with those things, you find it strange, don't you? Her statement hit home like an arrow. Adrian did not evade it. He admitted it. Perhaps, I built everything from nothing. I believe in strength and control. I don't trust anyone but myself. I used to be like that too, Nora replied, her voice slightly distant. Until I put my trust in someone else, and I paid the price. But I still want to believe that somewhere there are people worthy of trust. In that moment, under the warm yellow lights of the cafe, they were no longer the billionaire and the waitress. They were 2 lonely people, bearing their own scars. He was isolated by power, she was isolated by injustice, and in that isolation they found an unexpected empathy. Adrian realized he was smiling, a genuine smile, not forced, not calculated, a smile he hadn't realized he had lost for so long. "I have another offer for you," he said, leaning forward. "Not $100,000, and not the whole company as a joke. Come work for me." He paused, then continued. "Not as an employee, but as a partner. Let's rebuild that project together from the ground up, as equals." Nora looked at him, her eyes searching. But this time, she saw no arrogance or calculation. She saw a sincere offer, a real opportunity. For the first time since her betrayal, she felt a glimmer of hope, a feeling that maybe she could start to trust again. Nora did not answer immediately. Instead, she did a simple thing. She picked up the menu and ordered a plate of pasta. That action, ordinary and mundane, was her answer. It meant, "Yes, I'm staying. I accept." Adrian understood. He ordered his own meal. Their dinner continued, but the atmosphere had completely changed. It was no longer an interview, but the first strategy meeting between two partners. 2 weeks later, Nora Hayes was no longer a name in a restaurant's personnel file. She had a security badge, an office right next to Adrian's, and a new title: Strategic Partner, Project Veyron. She was reborn. Her suppressed energy and intellect were unleashed. She dove into the work like a storm, challenging the engineering team, redrawing the entire system architecture, and inspiring them with her sheer talent. Adrian often saw her staying late, standing before the massive whiteboard covered in complex equations, her face illuminated with pure passion. A new order had been established, but the past never stays buried. The phone rang from the reception desk in Adrian's office one Tuesday afternoon. David answered, and his face immediately changed color. "Sir," David said, covering the receiver, "there is a man named Julian Vance in the lobby. He's demanding to see Miss Hayes. Security says he's causing a scene." At the same time, in her own office, Nora stood before a glass whiteboard, marker in hand, completely absorbed in the flow of equations. She was so focused that she didn't hear the phone ring. Suddenly, the office door burst open. David rushed in, looking panicked. "Nora, don't go out." Nora turned around, surprised. "What is it, David?" "Just stay here for a moment," David said, his voice tense, then hurried back to Adrian's office. The sudden warning made Nora uneasy. She walked to the door, opening a small crack. From there, she could hear Adrian's voice over the intercom system, cold and sharp. "Show me the main lobby security camera." She held her breath. A large screen on the wall in Adrian's office, visible through the crack, switched to a feed from the main lobby. And then she saw him. Julian Vance. Time seemed to stop. Even through the camera screen, his presence hit her like a punch to the gut. Still the expensive suit, the perfectly slicked hair, and the confident smile that she had once loved deeply, and later hated to the core. He stood in the middle of the lobby, arguing loudly with the security chief, turning the Falcon Tower lobby into his own stage. "I just want to meet my former partner." His voice boomed over the speaker, piercing the glass, piercing the 2 years she had spent trying to escape. "Nora Hayes. She's working here, isn't she? I just want to congratulate her on her new project." The marker in Nora's hand dropped to the floor, making a dry clack in the silent room. Her breathing became shallow. That feeling returned. The feeling of helplessness, being hunted, being exposed to the eyes of the world. The wall of security she had just built around herself over the past 2 weeks seemed to be collapsing. She heard Adrian order Julian to be brought up to the office. A part of her wanted to run, to find a corner to hide. But another part, the scarred and hardened part, stood still. She couldn't run forever. A few minutes later, she heard the door to Adrian's office open, then close. She couldn't hear the conversation, but she could imagine it. Julian's smile, his smooth voice, and the malicious words wrapped in a veneer of politeness. She sat down in her chair, holding her head in her hands, trying to control her breathing. She had thought she was free of him. She had thought she could start over. But that shadow, it never truly disappears. It was just waiting. A moment later, Adrian's office door opened again. She heard Julian's footsteps receding, then the sound of the elevator. After that, silence. Her office door opened softly. Adrian walked in, holding 2 paper coffee cups. He said nothing, just silently placed 1 cup on her desk. The heat wafted up, carrying the familiar scent of coffee. He sat down in the chair opposite her, not as a boss, but as a friend. He looked at her whiteboard covered in equations. "Looks impressive," he said, his voice gentle. He didn't ask if she was okay. He knew she wasn't. Nora looked up, her eyes slightly bewildered. "What did he say?" "What he always says," Adrian replied, taking a sip of coffee. "About a contract, about joint intellectual property rights. He's trying to assert ownership over your work." "It's a lie," Nora said, her voice trembling slightly. "That signature—" "I know," Adrian cut in, his voice still calm but full of certainty. "I looked him in the eye, and I knew he was lying. But he fired a warning shot. He wants my employees to think we're involved in a scandal." Adrian set the coffee cup down. He looked straight into her eyes, and this time she did not see a powerful billionaire. She saw an ally. "Listen, Nora. He's doing this because he's scared. He knows how talented you are, and he can't stand seeing you shine somewhere else. He wants to drag you back into the darkness with him." He leaned forward. "This is no longer your fight alone. He made it my fight when he stepped into this building. And I—" he paused for a moment. "Never lose." His words were not a cliché comfort. They were a declaration, a commitment. They didn't dissipate her fear, but they ignited another fire within her, the fire of resistance. This time, she wasn't alone. Adrian stood up, a decisive action that ended the conversation. "Let's go," he said. "Nothing gets solved here." The action surprised Nora. She thought he would start calling the legal team, start a war from the top of the tower. But instead, he picked up his jacket and waited for her. "Go where?" she asked. "Away from here," he replied. "He wants to turn this office into a battlefield. We won't give him the satisfaction." He took her down to the basement garage, to a black sedan that looked anything but flashy. He drove himself, taking her away from the bustling financial district toward the high-end residential area overlooking Central Park. They didn't speak the entire way. The silence wasn't awkward. It felt like a necessary pause for both of them to breathe after the storm. He took her up to his penthouse. This place wasn't like his office. It was warmer, more personal, with walls lined with books and a grand piano in the corner. From the massive glass windows, the entire city of New York stretched beneath them like a carpet of lights. "Want something to drink?" he asked, loosening his tie. "Water is fine," she replied. He handed her a glass of water, then stood beside her by the window. The view was breathtaking, but Nora wasn't truly seeing it. Her mind was still reeling from the image of Julian. "You don't need to worry about him," Adrian said, his voice low and firm. "My legal team will handle that contract. It's fraudulent, and we will prove it." He turned to look at her, his eyes revealing a rare tenderness. "I told you, this is no longer your fight alone. It's ours." In that moment, standing on top of the world, with his strong commitment, Nora felt a defensive wall she had built up over the past 2 years begin to melt. She had found an ally, someone who believed in her. She nodded faintly, a look of gratitude flashing across her lips. But it was that very nascent trust that made what happened next feel even more cruel. "Before we act, you need to know exactly who we are dealing with," Adrian said, his voice slightly different. He moved away from the window, walked to a large screen mounted on the wall, and used his voice to activate it. Display profile, Julian Vance. A detailed profile appeared on the screen. Photo, biography, business history of Lumina Tech. Everything was familiar to Nora, but then she saw a small line below his name, a detail she had never known, a detail no one in the tech industry knew. Full name, Julian Vance Malik. Nora froze. Her breath seemed to solidify in her chest. She turned to look at Adrian, her eyes filled with confusion and disbelief. "Malik? Why does he have your last name?" Adrian didn't look at her. He looked at Julian's photo on the screen, and in his eyes was an old pain, a hatred deeply rooted in his blood. "Because we share a father," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "Julian is my paternal half-brother." Nora's whole world seemed to collapse. Everything she thought she knew about this situation was wrong. This wasn't an old enemy returning. This wasn't a business fight. This was a family feud. "Why?" Nora's voice cracked. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't want it to influence your decision." Adrian finally turned to look at her, and this time she saw a vulnerability he had hidden so well behind his powerful facade. "Julian isn't after you because of the technology. He's doing it because you are working with me. He's tried to take everything away from me since we were children. Our father always favored me, and he never forgave that." He stepped closer to her, his voice full of bitterness. "He doesn't really want Project Veyron, Nora. He wants to see me fail. He wants to take away something I care about." He paused, looking straight into her eyes. "And right now, that something is you." That last sentence struck Nora harder than Julian's appearance. She wasn't a partner found by chance. She was a pawn, accidentally stepping into a decades-long game of hatred. The trust she had just regained, the safety she had just felt, now shattered. And she suddenly realized she was facing a question even more frightening than Julian Vance. Could she trust a man who had hidden such a fundamental truth from her? Nora stood there, stunned. The luxurious penthouse seemed to shrink, squeezing all the air out of her lungs. Julian Vance Malik, Adrian's paternal half-brother. That truth was not like a missing piece, but like a hammer blow shattering the entire picture she was trying to rebuild. The first feeling was not fear, but a cold, bitter anger. The feeling of being deceived. "Why?" Her voice broke, losing its composure. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't want it to influence your decision," Adrian said, and this time his explanation sounded hollow. "Didn't want to influence?" Nora let out a bitter laugh. She took a step back, creating distance between them. The comforting hand he had just offered now felt like a pretense. "You knew from the start, didn't you? Since that night at the restaurant, when you asked who I was, you knew I was connected to Julian." Adrian was silent, and that silence was his confession. "Oh my God," Nora said, holding her head in her hands. "Everything. The partnership offer, the trust. Was it all just part of you brothers' game? You used me against him, and he used me against you." She looked at him, her eyes now holding not confusion, but utter disappointment. "I trusted you. For the first time in 2 years, I started to trust someone. And it turns out that person was also hiding earth-shattering secrets from me, also using me for his own purposes. You and he, are you any different? The same deceptive blood?" "Nora, that's not true," Adrian tried to explain, stepping toward her. "Don't come near me," she yelled, holding out her hand to stop him. "I'm tired of the lies. I'm tired of being a pawn in powerful men's games." The pain of old and new betrayal merged, forming a tsunami that swept away all the hope that had just been kindled. She couldn't stay here for another second. She didn't know who to believe. "I quit," she said, her voice turning cold and distant. "I will not work for you anymore. I will not be involved with your family ever again. Let you two brothers solve your own mess." She turned, walking quickly toward the elevator. "Nora, wait!" Adrian called after her, his voice showing a hint of panic for the first time. "Where are you going?" The elevator doors opened. Nora stepped in, without looking back. "Away from here. Away from both of you. I'll find a way to survive on my own, just like I always have." The elevator doors began to close, gradually obscuring Adrian's face, a face that was no longer that of a powerful billionaire, but of a man who had just lost the most precious thing he had found. When the cold steel door closed completely, Nora leaned against the elevator wall, and for the first time in 2 years, she let hot tears stream down her cheeks. She wasn't just running from Julian or Adrian, she was running from the fragile hope that she could be trusted again. And the brutal truth was, perhaps she had been wrong. The elevator door closed, leaving Adrian alone in the silence of the penthouse. He stood motionless, looking at the cold steel door that had taken Nora away. Her words still echoed in his head. "Are you and he any different?" The same deceptive blood. That sentence cut deeper than any business failure he had ever experienced. All his life, he had tried to be different, to escape the shadow of a family full of deceit and hatred. Yet in the eyes of the only woman he had begun to trust, he was just a replica of the very things he despised. Meanwhile, Nora stepped out of the Falcon Tower, blending into the anonymous crowd on the streets of Dubai. The tears had dried on her cheeks, leaving a cold sensation. She walked without purpose, just wanting to get far away from that place, from the lies, from the cruel game of the Malik family. She returned to her small apartment, the only safe haven she had left. She sat in the darkness, looking out the window. She had been right not to trust anyone. This world had no room for trust. She had survived the past 2 years on her own, and she would continue to do so. Tomorrow, she would find another job. Maybe a cafe, a bookstore, anywhere no one knew the name Nora Hayes or quantum technology. But as night fell, her initial anger began to subside, giving way to a deeper pain. She remembered Adrian's look when he spoke of Julian, an old pain she could sense. She remembered how he protected her, how he said, "This is our fight." Could it be that she had been too hasty? Could it be that she had let the fear of the past obscure the truth of the present? At the same time, at the penthouse, Adrian did not call the legal team. He did not start a fight. Instead, he did something he had never done before. He ordered David to cancel all meetings for the next day and prepare a press release, a release that would change everything. The next morning, Nora woke up with a decision. She couldn't run forever. She needed to face the truth, no matter how painful. She opened her laptop, intending to write an official resignation email to Adrian, a final conclusion to everything. But as the screen lit up, a news headline caught her eye. CEOADRIANMALICPUBLICSLEGAREGIANSCLWIDRIANVANCEPHALIANVANCEPHALIANVANCEPHALIANVANCEPHALIANVANCEPHALIANVANCEPHALIANVANCEPHALIANVANCEPHALIANVANCEPHALIANVANCEPHALIANVANCEPHALIANVANCEPHALIANVANCEPHALIANVANCEPHALIANVANCEPHALIANVANCEPHALIANVANCEPHALIANVANCEPHALIANVANCEPHALIANVANCEPHALIANVANCEPHALIANVANCEPHALIANVANCEPHALIANVANCEPHALIANVANCEPHALIANVANCEPHALIANVANCEPHALIANVANCEPHALIANVANCEPH Adrian had revealed everything. He disclosed his family relationship with Julian, a secret he had hidden his entire career. He condemned Julian's fraudulent behavior toward an unnamed female scientist who had been stripped of all her work. He pledged to use all the resources of Malik Corp to seek justice for her and expose all financial irregularities at Lumina Tech. But the part that stunned Nora the most was the final paragraph of the release. To ensure transparency and avoid any conflict of interest, I, Adrian Malik, will temporarily withdraw from all activities related to Project Veyron. Full decision-making authority and intellectual property ownership of this project will be completely transferred to my strategic partner. Her decision will be final. This project is hers, and hers alone. Nora read the passage over and over. He had relinquished control. He had placed the entire future of the billion-dollar project, the reputation of his company, in her hands. He wasn't trying to pull her back with words. He was proving it with action. He was giving her absolute trust, even when she had turned her back on him. This was not the action of a deceiver. This was not a power play. This was a sacrifice. Her phone vibrated. It was a text message from Adrian. It contained only a single line. "I have chosen my side. Now it's your turn." Nora looked at her phone screen, then out the window. She had run enough. Now it was time to fight. She stood up, put on her jacket, and walked out the door. This time, she knew exactly where she had to go. Nora did not go to the Falcon Tower. She hailed a taxi and went straight to another place, the headquarters of Lumina Tech. She walked into the main lobby, where Julian used to be king, with a confidence she had never possessed before. She was no longer a fleeing victim. She was the owner of Project Veyron, a force Julian could not underestimate. She demanded to see Julian Vance. The receptionist initially refused, but when she introduced herself as Adrian Malik's strategic partner and the one holding the key to the upcoming legal battle, the door opened. She faced Julian in his own office. He looked tired and angry after Adrian's announcement, but still tried to maintain his self-satisfied facade. "Nora," he said, "you're making a huge mistake trusting him." "My biggest mistake was ever trusting you," Nora countered, her voice cold and fearless. "I didn't come here to argue. I came here to inform you. This battle you have already lost." She placed a tablet on the desk, displaying Adrian's press release. "You see, you thought I was Adrian's weakness. But you were wrong. I am his weapon. And now, this entire project belongs to me. I won't just expose the fraudulent contract. I will work with Malik Corp's legal team to overturn every transaction, every email, every piece of evidence showing how you destroyed me." She leaned forward. "You may have taken my past, Julian, but I won't let you touch my future, or Adrian's future." With that, she turned and left, leaving Julian stunned in his office, realizing for the first time that his power play had completely crumbled. Nora left that building, feeling a burden lifted. She had faced her ghost and won. Now she needed to face her future. She found Adrian not at his office or the penthouse. He was in a place she never expected, the small cafe at Souk al-Bahar, where they had their first dinner. He sat alone at the old table, with just a cup of coffee. She walked quietly and sat down opposite him. He looked up, and in his eyes was immense relief. He didn't ask where she had been. He didn't say, "I told you so." He simply waited. "I saw the press release," Nora said, her voice soft. "Why did you do that? You could lose everything." "I almost lost something more important," Adrian replied, looking straight into her eyes. "Your trust. I realized that control means nothing without someone to share it with. I hid the truth from you, and that was my mistake. This is the only way I can prove that I truly stand with you. Not because of a family feud, but because of who you are." Nora reached out, placing her hand over his on the table. "I went to see Julian." Adrian looked slightly surprised. "I told him the fight was over," she continued, "and that he would never be able to hurt either of us again. A genuine, warm smile spread across Adrian's lips. "So you chose your side?" "No," Nora said, lightly squeezing his hand. "I didn't choose a side. I chose us." She pushed her tablet toward him. On the screen was a new legal document she had drafted herself. Adrian read it. It was a new partnership agreement for Project Veyron. Both their names were listed at the top as equal co-founders. "I promised the company was yours," Adrian said, slightly confused. Nora shook her head. "I don't need your company, Adrian. I don't want to own this project alone either. I want a partner, someone I can trust." She looked at him, and this time there was no fear or doubt in her eyes, only certainty. "It is not yours, nor is it mine," she said. "It is ours." Adrian looked into her eyes, then down at their hands clasped together. He had started this story with an arrogant joke of power, but in the end, he had found something greater than his empire. They sat there, in the warm yellow light of the cafe, no longer the billionaire and the waitress, no longer individuals bearing their own scars. They were two people who had found each other amidst the ruins, and together they were ready to rebuild everything, not just a technology project, but a shared future. A year later, at the International Technology Conference in Geneva, Project Veyron, now officially known as Aegis Quantum, was honored with the Technological Breakthrough of the Year award. Their encryption system proved its invulnerability, setting a new standard for global security. But the people who stepped onto the stage to accept the award were not Adrian or Nora, but their entire engineering team. That was their joint decision. They wanted those who had worked tirelessly to stand in the spotlight. Adrian and Nora watched from the audience seats, sitting side by side. When the name Aegis Quantum was called, Adrian turned to look at her, not with the pride of a CEO, but with the look of a man gazing at the woman he loved. "See," he whispered, "we did it." Nora smiled, interlacing her fingers with his. "No, we are doing it." After the ceremony, they did not attend the lavish reception party. Instead, they took a walk along the shore of Lake Geneva, the air fresh and cool. In the distance, snow-capped mountains appeared faintly in the twilight. "Do you remember the first night we met at Alcasa restaurant?" Adrian asked. "How could I forget?" Nora laughed. "The night an arrogant billionaire planned to give his entire company to a waitress." "I don't think that was arrogance anymore," Adrian said, stopping and turning to face her. "I think it was destiny. The universe grew tired of listening to me complain, so it sent the answer right before my eyes." He took a small black velvet box from his pocket. Nora held her breath. "Nora Hayes," he said, his voice deep and sincere. "You restructured my algorithm. You restructured my company. And most importantly, you restructured my life. You taught me how to trust, not just others, but to believe in a better future." He opened the box. Inside was a simple yet exquisite ring, with a small diamond sparkling like a star. "I don't want to just be your business partner anymore," he continued. "I want to be your partner in everything. Will you marry me?" Nora looked into his eyes, eyes that no longer held coldness or calculation, only love and respect. Tears of happiness gently streamed down her cheeks. She did not say yes. Instead, she smiled and said the phrase that had now become their own. "It is ours." And so, Nora and Adrian's journey reached its quiet conclusion, or perhaps its first true beginning. They had walked through so many nights together, late hours under the golden lights of Dubai's skyline, where ambition shimmered as bright as the desert stars, tense mornings in glass-walled boardrooms, where every word could shift the balance of power, and finally, tranquil evenings like this one, where silence spoke louder than success ever could. Their story was never meant to be a fairy tale about Cinderella and a prince. There was no glass slipper, no magical transformation, no happily ever after delivered by fate. What they found was something far more rare and far more human, a partnership built on scars, mistakes, and courage. It was not perfection that brought them together, but the willingness to understand one another beyond appearances. Because in truth, fairy tales end where reality begins. It reminds us that a person's greatest worth doesn't always lie in the place they currently stand, but in the strength, brilliance, or tenderness that lies hidden, waiting for the right moment, or the right person, to be seen. A waitress can possess the mind of a strategist, the heart of a creator, or the quiet intelligence that can change the course of an empire. And a billionaire who seems to command the world may still struggle with the one thing money can't buy: trust. Nora never needed a savior. What she needed was a chance, a door left slightly open, a moment to prove that her voice mattered. And Adrian, for all his wealth and control, didn't need another loyal employee. He needed someone unafraid to challenge him, to show him that true leadership is not about holding power over others, but having the humility to let someone else hold your trust. There's a kind of quiet power in that, in the way people learn to lower their defenses, in the way they rediscover the strength of vulnerability. Perhaps the greatest lesson in their story isn't found in the grand gestures or the dramatic twists, but in the ordinary choices, the ones that often go unnoticed. When Nora chose to speak up in a room full of silence, she changed more than her fate. She reminded everyone that courage doesn't always roar. It sometimes whispers. When Adrian tore up the contract instead of questioning her loyalty, he proved that faith can be louder than suspicion. And when both of them realized that yours or mine would never be as powerful as ours, they unlocked something that no amount of wealth, intellect, or influence could create alone: harmony. Maybe that's what love truly is, not the collision of perfect souls, but the meeting of two imperfect ones who decide that together they're better. Their journey reminds us that transformation doesn't always announce itself with fireworks. Sometimes it begins in quiet moments, in the act of listening, in the decision to forgive, or in the courage to start again. Nora and Adrian didn't rewrite a fairy tale. They redefined success. They proved that triumph isn't measured in numbers, empires, or applause, but in the rare ability to see beyond what the world expects, and to choose kindness when pride would be easier. As the sun set behind the snowy peaks of Geneva that evening, the light reflected off the lake like fragments of old dreams. Adrian's hand brushed against Nora's, and for a moment, all the chaos of their past, the pressure, the expectations, the battles, fell away. There was no billionaire and no waitress. There were simply two people who had learned to rebuild not just a company, but themselves. And perhaps that is the quiet magic of human connection, not something scripted by fate, but crafted by choice. Again and again, day after day. When we choose to trust instead of fear, when we choose to listen instead of judge, when we choose to believe that a new beginning can emerge even from the ashes of failure. So maybe this isn't the end of their story after all. Maybe it's just the point where endings and beginnings blur into one, a soft intersection where love, faith, and courage meet. Because at the heart of it all, their story isn't about business or wealth or power. It's about rediscovery of self, of hope, of what it means to be human. And if there's one truth that lingers after the final page closes, it's this: the most beautiful rebuilds are never made of steel or glass, but of trust. And trust, once shared, becomes the bridge that carries us towards something greater, something we can finally call ours. This story is now concluding, but I hope it opens something within you. Perhaps a little courage to speak up, a little faith in those around you, or simply a reminder that no matter how much life challenges you, there is always a path to rebirth from the ashes, like a phoenix. Thank you for taking the time to listen. I hope you found these moments meaningful. Wherever you are on your own journey, always hold firm to the belief in your self-worth. I look forward to meeting you in the next story.